I should begin by introducing myself. I'm Tom McDonough. I'm an art critic and an art historian from the US. And I'm here today to speak briefly with you, I guess I should say, not really about Roma culture, in a sense. I'm here to speak with you a bit about a Dutch artist, about Constant, oh my goodness, yes, now it's on, about Constant Nieuwenhuys. And an early project, or a project that was at the start of a series of architectural experiments of his, a project called Design for a Gypsy Camp. And it might make sense for me to say why I'm here at all. And the story really begins very simply. It really begins a few months ago, late winter in New York City, over a dinner with Maria. And she was telling me about the Roma Pavillion, about this project and the plans. And I happened to mention, in all innocence, Constant. And I said, well, did you know that this fellow created a design for an encampment for Roma people in northern Italy? And that began a series of conversations that ultimately, for better or for worse, resulted in my presence here today, and also worked, I think, in an important way to trigger a set of thoughts or inspire a design process by the artist who created the installation that you're sitting in and around, Arnold Meek's fantastic design here at the Palazzo Zorzi. So I guess I'm here to talk a little bit with you about this project and what it might have meant and what it might mean for us today. And now, many of you are going to be familiar with Constant. In the past 10 years, 15 years, he's become a rather well-known figure for precisely this series of architectural designs he created over a decade and a half long period or so, from the mid-1950s through the late 1960s, very early 1970s, a set of projects that are collectively known as New Babylon. You're seeing some of the maquettes that he created of New Babylon, which are conserved at The Hague in Holland here. Constant is an artist who was born in the mid-1920s, right? And really comes of age in the immediate post-war years. He was part of this collective of Northern European artists known as Cobra, right? From artists a group assembling artists from Copenhagen, Brussels, and Amsterdam, a kind of coalition of expressionist painters who are reacting against a dominant School of Paris painting in the post-war years. But Constant, by the early 1950s, is moving away from that aesthetic. And by the mid-1950s, late 1950s, is becoming more and more interested in problems of architecture, problems of spatial design. And that's ultimately what results in this remarkable series of models of a kind of utopian city, which is what New Babylon really is, right? It's a visionary urban design. And it's an urban design that, unlike most that we have, unlike what we're familiar with from the 18th century forward, which really lays out, the architect, designer lays out a final form for all time in which humanity would live, New Babylon is really premised on a very different idea. It's premised on an idea of flexibility and mobility. It's premised on the idea that people would no longer have to work, that in a post-war moment of automation, the kind of complete mechanization of labor, people would be free to do something else. And what would that be? It would be free to create the surroundings of their lives, free to create their own habitat. And so rather than being a society of what Marx might have called homo faber, right? Humanity as essentially engaged in labor, in a process of making. Constant was interested in a notion of homo ludens, that the essence of humanity lies not in work, but in play, right? Play understood in its most broad sense. So this is the kind of dominant notion of New Babylon that we have, this flexible city that would be free to respond to the desires of its inhabitants, who could continually remake it after their own will. It's a project he worked on, as I said, from the late 1950s until around, the project really ends by the early 1970s. And it's received a lot of attention after being almost forgotten. It's received a lot of attention in art and architectural circles over the past 15 years or so. And I think a dominant interpretation, in a way, of New Babylon has been this idea of it being a precursor to a kind of networked world, a world of dematerialized communication, right? And, this has been an important way that New Babylon's been read. But I think it misses something really crucial about this project. I don't think this is a project about dematerializing architecture at all. And I think, what that dominant reading forgets is the very particular origin points and very particular references that Constant was interested in at the origins of this project, which I think we can trace to this model from 1957, the design for a gypsy camp. Right? That it has its origins not in some notion of a universal architecture, but instead an architecture for a very particular population in a very particular place. And I want to talk a bit about that with you today and maybe propose a slightly different understanding of what this project was after. In a way, the story I want to tell is a story of a friendship between two people, between Constant, whom you see on the left here, and an Italian painter, Giuseppe Pinot-Gallizio. You see the two of them here photographed in Munich in 1959. And, they meet, these two figures are going to meet in the mid-1950s. They're going to meet largely within the orbit of the formation of the Situationist International. They'd both be founding members of this group, the Situationists, who were one of the probably the most militant, let's say, of the neo-avant-garde formations of the 1950s and early 1960s. There's a series of meetings that are held in northern Italy where Pinot-Gallizio lives. We're in northwestern Italy, up in Alba in the Piedmont, right? And one of Constant's former colleagues, Asger Jorn, who had been a Cobra painter as well, is spending time in northern Italy, begins to speak with Pinot-Gallizio about forming a larger grouping of artists, right? Forming a kind of experimental laboratory for the arts in Alba. And there's a congress held there, the first Congress of World Artists, held in September 1956, that brings together these kind of fragments of former Cobra artists, people involved in the northern Italian avant-gardes in Milan, and members of Parisian groups like the Lettrists, right? You see this kind of meeting here. And it's really around this Congress in 56 that Constant and Gallizio become friends. And Gallizio invites Constant to come down and spend more time in Alba, right, with him. And Constant will return at the end of that year, at the end of 1956. And it's there at that time that he's going to meet a local Sinti community living in Alba. A community that Pinot-Gallizio was quite involved with in these years, right? Because in addition to being an artist, Pinot-Gallizio in fact was not primarily an artist, a painter, but was a local figure, right? He was a pharmacist in Alba. He was a left town councillor. He had been a member of the communist resistance during the war. And in the post-war years, he's acting as a kind of advocate for this Sinti community. If you know Piedmont, it's in northwestern Italy, and it's really a long and important migration route or route of movement between Italy and France. And there's a community here of Sinti which are being pushed out of town in these years of the mid-1950s, right? They had formerly used a large market at the very edge of Alba as a place to stay over as they're moving through the city. And the local community, which is governed by a relatively conservative mayor at this time, refuses the right to camp, essentially, right, in Alba. And so Gallizio owns some land just across the river from town, and he gives people the right to use that land, essentially. He hands it over to these groups that are passing through. And he takes Constant out to visit this encampment, right? This Sinti encampment. And it's that meeting, right? It's that kind of encounter that will spur Constant on. But there's really a context here, I think, of Gallizio's engagement with a local community. And as I said, a kind of advocacy for the Sinti. And you can see here, there's a series of photographs that he makes, that Gallizio makes in 1956 with the Roma people in Alba, right? We can see him here posing with families. You can see him talking with local representatives. That's the market hall in the background on the left that was typically, that had been used as a site for caravans. Gallizio sees himself as a local spokesperson, as someone who's on the town council. And he, kind of collates these images, these photographs, into a poster that he places in the shop window of his local pharmacy. Speaking as you see here, captioning these as a kind of great battle for the rights of the gypsies, right, to encamp in Alba. And I should, we can talk about language in a minute, right? He places this in the window in Alba in 1957. It very quickly receives a response in the local press, right? This is an article from an Alba newspaper of 1957 titled The House of the Gypsy, right? Which shows an image right at the top of one of the signs there, forbidding encampment, right? It's you're forbidden to park your caravans here, right? And it says the laws exist, right? That the photograph is titled, and then beneath we see another photo of a caravan, and it says, but who's enforcing them? And it's this kind of complaint about about the Sinti community, right, in Alba, about it's complaining both about the aesthetics of the encampments, but then also complaining about a crime that's attendant upon these things, and essentially saying, well, if Dr. Gallizio, our esteemed local resident, wants to advocate on behalf of these people, wants to not only allow them to camp, but actually build a kind of house for them here, a place for them to stay on their way through Alba. This is impossible. If they want to do this, they should have to build them in every town in Italy so that we don't attract more people. I mean, these are kind of common, I guess we would call it in America, right? It's like a not in my backyard kind of argument, NIMBY before its time. But it gives you a good sense of the local climate in a way, right? The real hostility at the time to Sinti and Roma people in Alba. And it's really, that really provides the context in many ways for the project. So we have this local response, and the article actually ends by saying, and if there is going to be this design for an encampment for the gypsies, best not to leave it in the hands of these strange architects associated with Gallizio, with these people who are coming in. And of course, the reference is precisely to Constant, because already by mid 1957, he's been thinking about this project, right? And I wanted to show you an early version of the design for a gypsy camp here. It's actually no longer extant as far as I know. All right? This is a photograph preserved in the Gallizio archives. And I think it gives us a first sense of what Constant might have been thinking here. It's a very simple project made out of cardboard and plaster. We have this wonderful kind of, concrete, what's meant to be a concrete ramp spiraling up to a platform, which is then covered with a very lightweight, sort of tent-like structure. I think we can get, I think we have some idea of what Constant might be thinking about here. I think he's clearly trying to imagine an architectural form for that would express the mobility of the inhabitants, the temporary inhabitants of this setting, right? And there's a sense in which I think one can imagine the ramp as a site where that movement across the horizontal landscape is brought up and monumentalized, right? But at the same time slowed down until one reaches that great sort of circular plaza at the top. Maybe Constant was thinking about a project like Bertold Lubetkin's penguin pool at the Regent Park Zoo in London, probably one of the most famous pieces of architecture engaged in movement in these years. It's built just prior, about 2 decades earlier. Lubetkin was, of course, a Russian architect living in exile, a constructivist architect living in exile in England come the 1930s, founded one of the first modern architecture firms in England known as Tecton. Designs this fantastic pavilion for the London Zoo with Ove Arup, the great engineer. And of course, the way it works is that the penguins kind of waddle awkwardly up and down these ramps, right? And there's a way in which Lubetkin was interested in the contrast of the awkward movement of the penguin on land and then the beautiful kind of elegance of their swimming in the water as they jump off. So there's this kind of display, right? A visual display of movement. And I certainly think there's some kind of similar play in Constant's initial design. But the references shift, right? As I said, this is an early project. The final project is the one that you see here, which moves away from the monumental forms of the early design, right? Moves away from that great kind of concrete ramp, and instead imagines this sort of circular horizontal expanse. The curving ramp has now been fragmented into these low walls that protectively ring the site of the encampment. And a greater emphasis now not on monumentality but on lightness, right? Expressed even in the model in the use of this wonderful wire, the plexiglass. It's all about suddenly now transparency and openness and fluidity. We might think about a shift in reference here. A shift in reference from something like Lubetkin and the concrete ramps of the penguin pool to other types of constructivist design, to things like Naum Gabo, right? Another Russian emigre, a kind of who became, who left Russia relatively early on, left Russia in the 1920s, was taken up widely in the West in the post-war world as a kind of Cold War, what you might think of as a Cold War constructivist, and whose wire designs hovered somewhere between tabletop sculpture and monumental architecture. And Gabo is, I think, an important reference for someone like Constant in these years. Gabo is working, doing some major public projects in Holland. It does a major public artwork for Rotterdam in these very years, composed of a great wire construction, which I think certainly would be a reference point. But and I've thought about the relationship between Gabo and Constant before, and other people have spoken about it. But in thinking about this camp project over the past couple of months, the more I looked at these photos, the more I began to think of, I seem to be missing an image here, but the more I seem to be thinking of actually maybe it's here, no, sorry, of Duchamp and of Duchamp's bicycle wheel. And there's a way in which the design for a gypsy camp almost becomes a dissected or broken apart bicycle wheel. A form of mobility, right, of course. Duchamp famously called it, it was a kind of a studio plaything, right, for Duchamp, made in 1913. So, he liked to sit in his studio and he could spin it, and it was like looking, he talked about it being like looking into a fire, the flames of a fire. That movement of the spokes was mesmerizing, right? But, there's also a set of contemporary references for Duchamp in 1913. The form of the bicycle wheel is reminiscent of this great Ferris wheel, the Grande Roue in Paris, which was one of the real modern landmarks of the city at the turn of the century. It stood in Paris from the very end of the 19th century through the First World War. It's a tremendously tall Ferris wheel that, along with the Eiffel Tower, were the two really great modern landmarks. And we can think if Duchamp's bottle rack, the drying rack, is a kind of allegorical Eiffel Tower. The bicycle wheel, in a way, is a sort of allegorical Grande Roue. And I think, this form, maybe it might make sense that Constant was thinking about something like Duchamp. Not only constructivists like Lubetkin and Gabo, but also a Dadaist like Duchamp. After all, Duchamp's bicycle wheel of 1913, which had been lost, right, like so many of the ready-mades, was only recently recreated in 1951. Arturo Schwartz in Milan released an edition with Duchamp of them, so it's relatively recently on people's minds. But there seems to be a way in which, as a ready-made, Duchamp was taking a functional object and turning it into a non-functional one, right, turning it into an artwork, reifying it, placing it on this kind of modest stool pedestal. And I like the way in which, in a sense, we could see Constant reversing that process, taking the bicycle wheel out of its upside-down orientation, out of its ready-made status, out of its status as art, and instead laying it down on the ground, right, rotating it 90 degrees to turn it into a form of architecture, right, to turn it into a form of functional shelter, to turn it into a design for an encampment. Right? So these seem to be some of the terms that Constant's playing with in these years around this project. Forms which are all mediated through his fascination with Roma culture. And I think here, is, now we need to talk about something more complicated in a way. It's easy, I think, as an art historian for me to find, I could spend lots of time talking about references in this work, where it comes from, where it might lead to, and that's all very well. I think hunting for those kinds of sources is important. It tells us something about the work. But there's also, there's something beyond a formal context for it. And that's a social context. A social context within the art world of a kind of long-standing fascination with the gypsy as a cultural other, right? And here we see, it's a lovely photograph of Constant around 1957 playing his guitar. And he was fascinated by so-called gypsy music, gypsy culture, and the like. And hardly alone in that, right? Indeed, I think we can say that there's been a long-standing fascination within modernism for, as I said, the Roma as a cultural other. And this stands along a series, we know this history, right, in a sense. We've written this history for other social groups. We know about the borrowings of African culture. We know about modernism's fascination with the art of the mentally ill, right? That there's been a continual interest in reaching out beyond a Western canonical tradition, to appropriating, stealing cultural forms from outside that canonical Western history in order to reinvigorate, in order to rework the notion of what modernism is. And in fact, I mean, if we think about bohemianism, if we think about bohemianism as a cultural expression of the avant-garde, that term itself has its origins in Western European misperceptions of Roma life, right? I mean, that the Roma were seen to have originated in Bohemia, and hence the term bohemian. It's intimately, you know, these two things are intimately bound up. And, you know, we can think about a fascination from the 1830s and 1840s in Paris onwards with what was perceived to be, let's say, Roma life. And that spanned everything from popular prints, like Schlesinger's Enfant volé, you know, stolen child, which you see here, in which a Roma family has abducted a beautiful white baby and is ogling over it here on the left, to high cultural forms, right? To forms like Manet's Old Musician, in which you can see he actually is quoting an element from Schlesinger's print. It's a little washed out, but you can see in the print the girl who's standing second from the right holding a child in the sling is quoted by Manet in his figure on the far left of the Old Musician of 1861. Now, I mean, there's something obviously, what do we want to say? I mean, at best we can say problematic, and at worst demeaning and incipiently racist about these kinds of visions, this kind of appropriation of Roma culture. But I also want to insist on this as a dialectical moment, in a way, right? And while fully acknowledging the problematic nature of these appropriations, also want to think about this history, which is, you know, 100-year-long history that we might say stretches from something like Manet to Constant, as containing a set of critical perceptions at the same time. Because if we think about Manet's painting, The Old Musician, on the one hand, we can read it as a set of stereotypes of Roma culture, fine. But it's also a way for Manet to address displacement and dispossession. Right? Because we know that Manet in The Old Musician is thinking about the way that a contemporary urban renovation of Paris by Baron Haussmann in the mid-19th century was pushing out a working class and indigent population, the so-called dangerous laboring classes and dangerous classes, pushing them out of the center of Paris to create a glittering imperial capital for Emperor Napoleon III. And in fact, you know, this group that you see assembled in Manet's painting is not only a series of quotes from sources that range from popular prints like L'Enfant volé to very high art references like Watteau's Gilles, or to Manet's own paintings, earlier paintings. The man in a top hat is a figure from a Manet painting of 2 years earlier, a rag picker, right? It's not only a series of artistic references, but it's also a depiction of Manet's neighborhood, which was a poor neighborhood that was being torn down to create a way for the Boulevard Malherbe, one of the most fancy boulevards in the new Haussmannian disposition. So I think we can see a kind of double-sided nature or a dialectical nature to these, the way that European artists engaged in interest with Roma culture. I mean, it's both a misappropriation and provides a set of critical insights for thinking about the politics of dispossession. And that's true not only in the 1860s or 1850s and 1860s, but true in the 1950s and 1960s as well. This is a photograph of what a gypsy camp, so-called gypsy camp, a Roma encampment, looked like And we're here outside of Paris. We're just at the very northwestern edge of town, along the boulevard extérieur. And you see on the one side of the boulevard, social housing, right? The kind of subsidized housing created by the French state in the years between the First and Second World War. These sort of barrack-like brick buildings of 3 stories. And then across the boulevard is what was known as the zone, right? It was a former area of a military, a wall ringing Paris. The wall had been torn down, but it hadn't been built on yet. And the zone, this terrain vague, was a favored site for displaced people and for the French avant-garde. I mean, this is where the surrealists went exploring in the 1920s and 1930s, because we're very close to the Puce, the famous flea markets by the Porte de Clignancourt, where André Breton spent lots of time. The situationists like Guy Debord and his colleagues loved to wander through this area as well. And as I said, it's actually a space that's inhabited, right? Inhabited by these itinerant populations, both North Africans, Roma, and the like. And this is one image from a series of quite remarkable photographs taken by Paul Almazy, who is a Hungarian photojournalist living in Paris. He takes a series of Roma encampments at the gates of Paris in 57, 58. Actually under the auspices, I should say, of UNESCO. They commissioned him to create this series on the Roma of Europe. There's also photographs from Spain and photographs from Italy as well, but I think the Parisian ones are most remarkable. And in a sense, you see these people caught between 2 dispensations, right? Because they're being surrounded by this new kind of housing, right? A state-subsidized, standardized housing that's precisely meant to arrest a population, right? To stabilize a population. And that's true both of the interwar housing that you see on the kind of right side of the image, and also of that new form arising in the distance, right at the very horizon in the back left-hand side. These new concrete slabs going up in modern architectural forms. Inspired by architects like Corbusier. Inspired by buildings like his great Unité d'Habitation, built down in Marseille from the late 1940s to the early 1950s. It's this response to a post-war housing crisis. Of course, France was devastated in the Second World War, and there was an intense shortage of housing, particularly of housing with decent conditions. And the response was largely through very standardized forms like that you see rising up in the image on the left. And it's this image of housing that I think Constant and his colleagues within the Situationist International were trying to respond to. I mean, they saw the housing crisis as not primarily an architectural problem, but as a social problem or a political problem. And that the response given by the French state, the response given by states across Europe in these years, as inherently repressive. And they really aligned work like Corbusier's effectively with the form of a prison, right? And you can see plans of a panoptic prison here reproduced in a book created by Debord and Asger Jorn right around these same years. So we have this idea that that modern architecture, this architecture in the post-war period, was essentially a carceral architecture, an architecture of stasis. But we have to be careful, I think, about those generalizations, because at the same moment that we have these great concrete slabs rising up around, there's also a strain of modernist architecture that's fascinated by mobility. There's it's very possible to accommodate the most intense mobility within modern architectural form. I mean, here we can just compare, right? I mean, rather than Constant's encampment, we could put up something like this. E.N.L. Schein, an important experimental architect in France in these years, with his cabine hôtelière, these kind of mobile architecture for a new leisure society of the mid-1950s. They're essentially caravans, not all that different from the ones we see circled around in the terrain vague outside of Paris. So certainly, modernism of the 1950s could accommodate mobility, could accommodate this notion of a new leisure culture. But I think Constant's after something different here. I mean, I think when we reduce New Babylon to simply an expression of a culture of leisure, a culture of mobility, the realm of a homo ludens, I think we miss something important. I think we miss the critical origins of this project and the way in which it's his early engagement in 1956-57 with the Sinti population of Alba opens up, not toward a dematerialized architecture, but towards a critical address of nomadism, which might end up more, we might think ends up more in a space like this, Mario Merz's igloos of the late 1960s with their own concerns for nomadism as a space of resistance, right? Here this igloo made out of little sandbags is circled by a famous saying by the North Vietnamese commander-in-chief, General Giap, who was fighting the Americans at that time. But I suppose I don't want to conclude on nomadism, which I think perhaps opens up its own realm of cliche. I want to think about, I want to conclude maybe by thinking about Constant's project as a means of approaching the other, right? So as not simply, in other words, not simply as an appropriation of Roma culture, but rather as some attempt to find a meeting ground, right, between European artists and this dispossessed population. Right? And I suppose one way we might do it, I mean, there are multiple ways of approaching this problem, but one possible way is through a contemporary piece of writing, through a late essay by the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who in 1955 is asked to come give a speech on the occasion of the 175th birthday of a German composer. And he gives a talk that will become known as, published under the title Gelassenheit, which is a typical Heideggerian neologism. We could translate it maybe as something like releasement. And I mean, Heidegger opens this talk on the figure of the exile, on the figure of displacement. I mean, he's interested precisely in the way in which stabile homelands, stabile points of origin, rootedness, has been done away with in the post-war world. That we're living in a world in which uprootedness and displacement is becoming an increasing norm, increasingly prevalent. And, this is a problematic condition for him. But the issue for Heidegger is not a return to rootedness. I mean, there's no turning back for him to an earlier condition, right? Rather, there's a need to create a new understanding, to move through displacement, through exile, to a new understanding of what dwelling might be. We cannot dwell in the rooted way that one's ancestors might have. And so what would this paradoxical condition of a uprooted dwelling be? And he talks about the essential term here being that of releasement, a kind of openness to the other, right? A willingness to not pin the other down to a particular identity, a particular place, a particular point, but rather an openness which is willing and able to retain the mystery of this encounter. And now it may seem counterlogical to bring together figures as disparate as Martin Heidegger and Constant. But I think that there is a ground on which we can draw them together. I mean, I'm certainly not claiming, I want to be clear here, I'm certainly not claiming that Constant was influenced by this Heidegger text or read it or had any knowledge of it. However, if we think about a French writer, a French philosopher, like Henri Lefebvre, then we can begin to see some connections, right? Lefebvre, who was one of the, perhaps in these years, the most significant French reader of Heidegger, and a figure who was crucial for bringing this German philosopher into French culture, precisely around the question of dwelling, right? In the 1950s and early 1960s, Lefebvre is reading Heidegger on the problem of dwelling. Lefebvre is also fascinated by Constant's New Babylon project. And ultimately, I think both of these sources will inform his work of the late 1960s, where he's considering a kind of revolutionary urban design, a revolutionary urban form under the motto or under the emblem of a right to the city. This notion of, again, which seems to be related to an inclusive vision of a new kind of mobile urban form, open to the transformations of its inhabitants, a new kind of dwelling. And so it's here, I think, that we come full circle and can begin to understand New Babylon as an expression of this right to the city, and a right that Constant understood precisely through this early engagement with the Sinti of Alba, a population which, there's still a camp for itinerants on what had been Pinot-Gallizio's property across the Tanaro River from the town of Alba, a problem that's not been addressed or solved. Constant's design remained, needless to say, unbuilt, but perhaps a continual provocation into the present. So I want to, this is obviously a kind of impressionistic discussion with you that I hope might raise more questions than it sets out to answer. So I'm happy to both thank you for time and surviving some humid Venetian weather with me, and happy to take questions from you as well. All right? Thank you very much.